"You're dangerous and mine," said the saloon girl after the cowboy fought the whole town for her. The bottle was nearly empty when Calhoun Greer walked into the Meridian for the last time that winter. That's how I remember it, not by the date, not by the cold, though it was the kind of cold that gets into the hinges of things and stays, but by that bottle. Brown glass on the bar top, the last 2 fingers of rye sitting in it like they were deciding whether to stay or go. Calhoun walked in and those 2 fingers were still there, and by the time everything was done, that bottle was on the floor in pieces, and a man was face down in them. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's how memory works, I think. It runs toward the part that mattered. My name is Dolan Reese. I was 41 years old that winter in Harlan's Fork, which is a town that doesn't exist anymore, not in any atlas, not in any county record I've ever been able to find since. Just gone. The way places go when the railroad moves 2 valleys over and takes all the reasons with it. Back then, it had a main street with 6 buildings that mattered and about a dozen that didn't, and the Meridian Saloon was one that mattered, and I had been working there going on 3 years by then. Not as a barman. Not as anything with a title. I did what needed doing. Hauled ice in the mornings when there was ice to haul. Fixed the roof in October when the wind pulled 3 boards loose. Sat at the corner table closest to the door on nights when the crowds got rough, which was most nights. Owen Pierce, who owned the place, had a word for what I did. He called it being useful. I'd heard worse. I'd come to Harlan's Fork the way most men come to a place like that, running out of somewhere else to be. I had been a deputy over in Crater Wells for 4 years, and then there was a thing with the sheriff's brother-in-law that I won't go into except to say that I was right, and it didn't matter that I was right. And then I wasn't a deputy anymore. Didn't have a wife. Had a horse named Copperhead and a Winchester that had belonged to my father and about $40 when I rode into town. Owen gave me a job because his last useful man had drunk himself sideways into the river, and I stayed because $40 goes faster than you plan for, and then I stayed some more because staying had become a habit. The woman's name was Vera Nelcass. I want to say that carefully because she deserves to be named carefully, and I know I'm going to spend a good portion of what I've got left to say talking about everything around her, and I don't want her to get swallowed up in it. Vera Nell had been at the Meridian about 6 months before I started there. She was one of 4 girls Owen kept on, not for the thing people always assume because Owen Pierce was a specific kind of man and his place was a specific kind of establishment, but for the drinking and the company and the piano on Friday nights. She played piano. That surprised me when I first heard it, which was the 2nd day I worked there, and she glanced up at me from the keys and said, without stopping, "What did you think I did mop the floors?" I said I hadn't had a thought about it either way. She gave me a look then that I'd come to know well, a look that was checking something, taking a measurement I couldn't see, and she nodded once and went back to playing. She was 33. Brown hair, not particularly remarkable, except that she wore it pinned in a way that meant she didn't care what men thought of how she wore her hair. She had hands that were roughed up from work, real work, before the Meridian and green-gray eyes that saw around corners, or that's how it felt. She wasn't soft about anything. She'd seen the kinds of things that happen to women who have no particular protector, and she'd made her peace with it the hard way, which is the only way that peace gets made in places like Harlan's Fork. We were not a couple. I want that said plainly because this story isn't about courtship. We were friendly, and then we were friends, which is a thing that takes longer and costs more, and by that 3rd winter I knew her in the way you know someone when you've been working the same rooms for 2 years. I knew she put too much sugar in her coffee and wouldn't admit it. I knew she had a younger brother somewhere in Missouri she hadn't written to in a long time and thought about more than she let show. I knew that when a man got too forward, she had a way of going very still and quiet that meant she was deciding how bad she was going to let it get before she did something about it. I'd seen her do something about it twice. Both times I hadn't needed to get up from my corner. All of that context matters because of Calhoun Greer. Calhoun was a cattleman, or had been. By that winter he was something that had worn down from a cattleman. He still had money, or the appearance of money, which is a different thing that takes longer to run out, and he had 4 men who rode with him from town to town, which was enough to make most establishments treat him like he was something. He came to Harlan's Fork in November of that year. He came 3 nights in a row, and the 3rd night he put his hand on Vera Nell's arm when she set down his drink, and she went very still. I watched from my corner. She said something quiet to him. He didn't move his hand. She said something else not so quiet. He smiled in a way that made me put down the glass I'd been holding, but she handled it. She took his hand off her arm with 2 fingers, the way you move something that's in the wrong place, set it on the bar top, and walked away. Calhoun Greer watched her walk away with a look I knew the taxonomy of, because I'd seen it on men before, and I knew what it grew into if you let it. He came back in December, twice. The first time was ordinary enough. The second time he brought all 4 of his men, and they started drinking early in the afternoon, which is a thing that means something different than drinking in the evening. It means the drinking isn't the point. I moved my chair. Not a lot, just angled it. Nothing happened that night. Calhoun watched Vera Nell across the room with that measuring look, and she did not look back at him. And eventually his men were too drunk to be useful to him, and they all went back to wherever they were sleeping. Owen came to me after close and said he thought maybe it would be good if Calhoun stopped coming in. And I said I agreed with him. And Owen said he didn't think he could make that stick without it becoming a thing. Meaning without it becoming the kind of thing where the town took sides and Owen wasn't sure the town would take his. That was true. Harlan's Fork was a place that liked Calhoun Greer, or liked what Calhoun Greer spent, which is not the same thing but looks the same from the outside. I went to Vera Nell. We were in the back after close, and she was sitting at the small table where she kept her things, and she had her coffee with too much sugar, and she was looking out the narrow window at the dark street. I sat down across from her without asking, which was something I could do by then. I said, "You know what he wants." She said, "I've known since the 3rd night." I said, "Owen's not going to back you if it gets loud." She looked at me then, not at the window, at me. "Are you?" I hadn't been planning to say it out loud, but I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't want you getting hurt on my account." And I said what I said, which was, "My account and yours aren't that separate anymore." She looked at me again with that measuring look. And then she nodded once, the same nod as the first day at the piano, and drank her coffee, and we sat there a while longer without talking, and that was the conversation. The thing with Calhoun Greer happened on a Tuesday in January, which I remember because Tuesdays at the Meridian were supposed to be the quiet nights, and they often weren't, but that one had been until about 8 o'clock. It was cold enough outside that the air had a sound to it, a thin, constant tone I couldn't quite locate, and the fire in the Meridian stove had been burning all day and made the place feel close and orange in the lamplight. There were maybe 12 men in the saloon when Calhoun came in. Just him, no writers. That was the first thing that was wrong. A man like Calhoun doesn't go anywhere without his writers, unless he's doing something he doesn't want witnessed by them, which is worse than being watched. He walked to the bar. He ordered a drink. He was very polite about all of it, which was the second thing that was wrong, because polite is a tool like any other and it has particular uses. Vera Nell was at the piano. It was a Tuesday, so there wasn't music, just the piano sitting there, and she was wiping it down, which was something she did every week whether it needed it or not. Calhoun got his drink and walked to the piano and stood there. I saw her see him coming, her back straightened by a fraction. I got up from my chair. He said something I couldn't hear. She went still. I walked over slow and easy, not making a production of it, and I came around to where they were both standing, and I said, "Calhoun," by way of hello, and he looked at me, and his face did a thing where the polite part went away and what was underneath it came forward. He said, "This is between me and the lady." I said, "I'm in the way of that." He said, "Then move." And I said, "I'm not going to do that." What happened next was not what anyone in the room was expecting, including me. He swung first. I'll give him that he didn't try to talk me sideways. He just decided and acted. And he was bigger than I'd thought, not fat big but solid, and he caught me just above the ear with the heel of his hand, and I went into the piano, which made a sound I can still hear if I concentrate. Vera Nell stepped back, just stepped back out of the way, gave me room. I want to note that. She gave me room. A lot of women would have grabbed at an arm or screamed or done some number of things that would have made the next part harder. She just moved, very deliberate, and cleared the space, and I always loved her a little more for that specific thing. I got off the piano and hit him 3 times fast, which is a strategy that works on bigger men because you're inside their range before they've gotten organized. He was solid, but he wasn't practiced, and the third one caught him at the hinge of his jaw, and he sat down hard. 2 of his riders had come in, not where they'd been earlier. These were men who'd been waiting outside. So the no riders thing had been its own kind of lie, and they came in through the side door and things got complicated. I won't account for every moment of the next several minutes, because memory compresses violence the way it doesn't compress other things. You remember the shape of it and some very sharp individual details, and your body remembers things your mind has let go. What I know is that both of Calhoun's men were in it, and 2 other men from the saloon joined them. Whether because they were with Calhoun or because fighting is its own invitation, I never found out. And at some point Calhoun was back up and it was 4 against 1, and the room had gotten very small, and the brown bottle I mentioned, the one with the last 2 fingers of rye, it caught me across the shoulder and put me on my knee. I was on my knee on the floor of the Meridian Saloon, and I had one hand on the boards, and I was working on getting back up, and I heard something. Vera Nell's voice, not afraid. That's what registered first, not afraid and not pleading, just a tone of voice that meant she had made a decision. She said, "Stop." And then, "Stop now. All of you." The room did a thing I'd not seen a room do before. It went quiet, not peaceful quiet, tight quiet like the held breath kind. I got my knee up and my hand up, and I was standing by the time she crossed the room, and she came to me, just to me, walked past Calhoun, past his men, past all of it, and she put one hand against my jaw and she turned my face toward hers, and she looked at me, and she said in a voice that every man in the Meridian could hear, "You're dangerous and you're mine. Does anybody here need it explained a second time?" I felt the blood from my lip going down my chin, and I was probably not a compelling sight, but she was looking at me with a kind of steadiness that I had not been looked at with in so long I had trouble finding the word for it. Not pity. Not fear, just a woman who had decided something and was telling the room what she'd decided, and the room could take it or leave it. Nobody moved. Calhoun Greer stood with his coat askew and a split eyebrow and what looked like a decision running through him. I kept my eyes on him. He looked at Vera Nell. He looked at me. Then he looked at the floor, and then he picked up his hat and he left. His men followed. The other 2 men who joined in followed after. The brown bottle lay in pieces where it had landed. Owen Pierce came out from behind the bar. He looked at the room. He looked at me. He looked at Vera Nell. He said very quietly, "I'll need to know if any of them are coming back tonight." I said I didn't think they were. He nodded. He went and got a broom. Vera Nell hadn't moved her hand from my jaw. She turned my face a little more toward the lamp to see the damage, and she made a small sound, and she went and got the rag she used for the piano, and she brought it back, and she held it against my lip, and I held it there with her hand still on mine, and we stood in the middle of the Meridian like that while Owen swept around us and the other men in the saloon went back to their drinks with the careful attention of people who have decided they saw nothing. She said, "Do you know what you are?" I said I had some idea. She said, "No, you don't. Men like you never do." We went outside after a while. The street was empty, and the air was still making that thin, high sound, and there were stars everywhere, a kind of ridiculous number of them, the way it gets when it's cold enough. She had put her coat on, and I hadn't bothered with mine. We stood in front of the Meridian, and she had her hand through my arm, not like a woman who needs an arm for balance, but like a woman who has decided where her arm is going to be. I said I was sorry she'd had to step into it. She said, "I didn't have to, I chose to." There's something in that word when a particular person says it. Chose. The difference between did and chose is the difference between something that happened to her and something she decided. She was telling me she'd decided. I didn't have much to say to it, so I didn't say much. We stood and the cold came in off the high plains where it had been building for weeks, and I could feel the rag she'd given me going stiff against my lip, and my shoulder was starting to tell me it was not happy about the bottle. All of it felt very real and very particular, which is the thing I remember most about it, even now. After a while she said, "Dolan." And I said, "Yeah." She said, "I'm not asking for anything, I'm just telling you something." I waited. "I would do that again," she said. "For you specifically, not for any man in general, for you." And I said, "I know." She looked at me like maybe she didn't think I knew. Maybe she was right, but I was starting to. That was the beginning, though it was already a year into something neither of us had named. Things don't start when you meet someone. They start when they start, which is a different moment entirely. And for us it was that night in January with the cold air and the stars and her hand through my arm, and the particular way she'd said that word chose, like she was making a note of it for herself as much as for me. The rest of that winter was quiet. Calhoun Greer did not come back to the Meridian. Whether he thought better of it or simply moved to the next town, I never found out. The quiet was partly his leaving and partly something that had settled in the room after that night. Something about the way I sat in my corner now, which was the same chair in the same position. But men looked at it differently, and men looked at Vera Nell differently, and the two difference were connected. Owen raised my wage in February. He didn't say why. He was not a man who explained himself, and I was not a man who needed him to. I fixed the south wall of the Meridian in March, where the winter had done damage. Vera Nell brought me coffee with the right amount of sugar in mine, which was also the right amount, just in case I'm not being clear. And she sat on the overturned bucket I was using as a step, and she read to me from a newspaper that was 3 weeks old, which was the freshest news we were likely to get out there in the spring mud. And I worked and she read, and the sun came over the mountains and hit the front of the building, and made the wood smell good the way it does, when winter has been in it for a long time. I want to be careful about how I say what came next, because it's easy to make it sound like a thing that had a speech or a moment, and it didn't. We didn't have that kind of story. We had a slower thing, a thing made of small decisions that accumulated into one large one. What it came to was this. By April, she had stopped sleeping at the boarding house where she'd kept a room for 3 years, and she was sleeping at the small house I'd rented at the east end of the main street, and neither of us had said much about it that I can remember. It was just what was. She had a cup on the shelf. Her hairpins were on the windowsill. Her coat was on the peg by the door. These were the facts of the situation, laid out in physical objects, which is the language that mattered. There is one more thing I want to tell. It was late April, a warm evening, the first one where you believed it was going to stay warm. We were on the porch after supper, which was a thing we did when the weather allowed, just sitting. The light was going orange and long, and the street was empty except for a dog investigating something near the farrier's shop. Vera Nell had her feet up on the rail and her coffee, and I had my pipe going. She said, "Do you ever think about what you'd have done if I hadn't come in that night?" I thought about it. I said I'd have gotten there eventually. She smiled at that, not a big smile, just the one. I said I might have taken longer. She said, "You would have been fine." I said, "Probably." She looked at me then, and the light was doing something particular to the side of her face, all that orange and gold, and she said, "But I wanted to. That's the difference." I knew what she meant. It was the same word she'd said in January in the cold. Chose, wanted to. The difference between something that happens to you and something someone decides to do because you specifically are worth deciding for. I don't have a way to say what that meant to a man who had been running out of places to be for the better part of 10 years. I don't have the words for the particular weight of being chosen. I just know what it felt like sitting on that porch, with the long orange light coming across everything and her feet on the rail, and her coffee getting cold, and the dog finishing its investigation, and the whole world going quiet around us. I reached over and took her hand. She let me. Her fingers were rough the way they'd always been, and they were warm from the mug. We sat there until the light was gone. That's the story. It doesn't end with a wedding or a pronouncement or any of the shapes that stories like this are supposed to end with. It ends on a porch in April with a good woman who decided something and a man who spent a long time not being decided about. And when someone finally decided, he knew it enough to be still for it. Harlan's Fork doesn't exist anymore. The Meridian is gone. But that evening is somewhere I can still get to when I need it, and I need it less than I used to because I don't live in that evening anymore. I live in the thing that came after it, which is its own kind of quiet. Her coffee went cold, she didn't care. I refilled it and we went inside, and I closed the door against the dark. And the latch made the sound it always made, a particular sound, solid and right, and that was that.